Me. There we go. There's my beautiful face. How's everybody doing today? If you can hear me, or I guess if you can't hear me, post something in the chat to let me know, and we'll get started here. So very cool. Again, starting a new kind of a system for running our live shows. So bear with me while I figure out all the cool stuff that's available here. All right. So let's get started. So Friday Kubernetes Q&A. Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Noel. Good to see you. It's morning for me, maybe afternoon for you, or wherever you are in the world. Welcome, and let's get started with Friday Q&A. Raul, nice to see you. Nice to see everyone in the Friday Kubernetes Q&A. Looking forward to answering your questions, but I just wanted to cover a few things before we get to the Q&A section. So first off, this is presented by KubeSkills. KubeSkills is a community that is for everyone learning Kubernetes, and we have some great resources in there. I like to think of it as a culmination of all the best resources that you can get for learning Kubernetes. We have these weekly Q&As. We have special guests. This Not this Friday, but next Friday we'll have one of my personal favorite people, Josh Duffney, to tell us, give us a few tips and tricks for how to learn systems for learning Kubernetes, which is really interesting to me. If you're into personal knowledge management, that's going to be a good episode to watch next Friday. So tune into that. Hope everyone's having a good kind of holiday season here. We're streaming live on YouTube. This is really exciting. We're kind of doing this for the first time. We've been using our private platform for a while, running these on a weekly basis, but we're just started to get kicked off, kind of streaming to the world here. So I'm looking forward to seeing all of you here. So KubeSkills is a community of people learning Kubernetes. Go to kubeskills.com if you haven't already. Join the community. We'd love to have you and love to hear what you're learning about. Every month we have a leaderboard, which we post and kind of see who's contributing to the community, who's help everyone, who's helping everyone learn Kubernetes, and wherever you are in your journey, you have a place here. So looking forward to seeing you in the KubeSkills community. Let me share my screen and kind of show you what the community looks like, so you can get familiar with it. So let's see here, share screen. And so if you see my screen here, we'll pull up the community and what that looks like. So let me zoom in here and go full screen. So when you log into the KubeSkills community, this is a platform, much like a social media platform, but it's just for KubeSkills and this community learning Kubernetes. So you come into here and you'll usually get directed to the homepage, which tells you all the posts that we've recently put in here, and everyone introducing themselves, and everyone giving tips and tricks for learning Kubernetes. We have a KCNA giveaway coming up in a couple weeks here, and you can find out about that. I usually, basically everything that I'm doing at my job and learning on my path, I kind of share in this community. So there's a lot of tidbits about you know this learning from failure post that I did the other day, which showed this show that Rocco does, or David does, that goes through troubleshooting Kubernetes, and how to get your cluster back in a operational state or running state. So So those are some of the things that I find really useful for learning Kubernetes, especially when you're first starting out, or maybe you're on the job and want different ways of troubleshooting your clusters. And so I really find that really useful to. And there's lots of episodes. It's called Clustered on YouTube, and so I would highly encourage you to check that out. But yeah, we have other people in here, just saying hi. I also post job listings in here if you're interested in getting started, making a career change, or maybe, uh, you know, getting a new job in the Kubernetes industry, or in that field. Um, let's see. It seems like a lot of me posting in here, but I swear there's other people. If we go to say hello, we'll see everyone who's joined and just kind of saying hi and introducing themselves. So really happy to have it's 200 people plus strong. So I encourage you to go to kubeskills.com and join our community. We'd love to have you. So we have different certification channels that you can tune into to learn how other people are studying for their exams. Um, on the left hand side, as you kind of notice here, we're navigating through the different channels and seeing how you can get started with the KubeSkills community. So we have this uh, Kubernetes 101 course that you can take that kind of familiarizes yourself, if you're just a beginner, to what the different components of Kubernetes are. So anyways, that's the community, and I encourage you to join. And we have lots of good people in there, and lots of good ways to get started on your or continue in your learning journey. Um, Another thing I wanted to point out, we encourage the use of killercoded.com. And I really like this platform because it allows you to spin up a Kubernetes cluster in seconds. So we can go to killercoded.com, go to playgrounds, and spin up a Kubernetes 1.25 cluster, and we can get to using Kubernetes right away. So um, you even have the alias. So kubectl is alias to k. So we can do k get nodes and see that this is a 2 node cluster. And so you can really play around with, how Kubernetes works, and, viewing all the cluster components with a get pods, o wide, um, or in all namespaces. And you can see, the API server, controller manager, scheduler, all running as pods in the kube system namespace, for example. So this is a really quick way to get up and running with Kubernetes. And just as it's listed here, it's the playground for running your applications on Kubernetes. What else did I want to cover today before we turn it over to the Q&A? So let's see. Um, yeah, that's pretty much it. So I just wanted to emphasize that in our community, it's a community for everyone. We a lot of times reference the Killer Coda environment for playing with Kubernetes and getting your hands dirty, because as we all know, Kubernetes is best when you're getting hands on, you're getting that practice, especially if you're studying for the exam. And uh, whether it's the CK, CKS, or CKD, it's a practical exam, and we need that practice to be able to hone our skills and to really drive it home to what we're trying to learn in Kubernetes. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and open it up for questions. So this is Kubernetes Q&A. So feel free to jump in with your questions. Just post them in the chat if you're watching, and we'll get to answering some questions. And then while we wait for questions to roll in, I'll go ahead and cover some other stuff and other questions from the community that we've had over the past couple weeks. So let's go ahead and go ahead and post your questions. All right. So, um, let me just go through a few things that I've been working on first, and then I'll go through some general questions. So let me present my screen again. All right. So, um, as you may know, I've been working on the very last chapter of my book, the CKA prep book. It's called Acing the Certified Kubernetes Administrator Exam. It's on Manning.com. And now you can get a live preview if you go to acingthecka.com. So here's the book I'm talking about. And so if you want to, get a peek, you can click on look inside and then you can, view the first 6 chapters. So I'm working on the last chapter here. All the other chapters are in review and should be out soon. So I'm looking forward to releasing those soon. But one of the things that in the book there are a lot of exercises, and I really like presenting these exercises because, like I said, the CKA exam, along with the CKAD and the CKS, are practical exams. They're in the terminal. They're giving you a task, and you have to perform those commands in the terminal to complete the task. All right. So one of the exam tasks from the book is a task that presents you with a pod, or actually a deployment, but a pod within that deployment, um, which has some kind of error. So let's view that error. So kubectl, or we can do K for short, and let's get um, namespaces. And I happen to know that this particular deployment is in the DB09328 namespace. And I always recommend using autocomplete. So I just typed in DB and hit the tab key on my keyboard to autocomplete that namespace. Or you can reset your context so that you're always looking inside of the DB09328, and they will have those types of namespaces on the exam, by the way. And so I can reset my context. So I can do a config set context, and then I can do the current context, which is this current cluster, and then I can do the namespace and equals, and then DB09 328. Now that our context has been modified, we can do k get deploy and then comma and then pods, because we want to see the deployment and then the pods within that deployment. So in this case, there's only one pod in this deployment, and it's in a crash loop backoff state. So I think this is most realistic to real life, right? Where we're on the job and we have a problem to solve. We don't necessarily know, how that problem began, or we don't necessarily have the context. But a lot of times it's like my cluster is broken. How do I fix it? Right? That's what your customer says, and you're responsible for going in and figuring it out. So I like these troubleshooting scenarios just because um, it's there's very few times where you're on the job and you have to create a cluster from scratch or create a deployment from scratch. It's usually, you have this existing deployment. There's something wrong with it. You have to go in and fix it. So troubleshooting is the number one kind of skill to have as a Kubernetes administrator, or whatever position you're in if you're managing clusters at all. So anyway, so we have this pod in a crash loop backoff. Okay, so yeah, first thing we usually do when we're trying to troubleshoot is we describe the pod. So we can do kubectl, or K for short, and then describe pod, or PO for short, and then you can start typing my, and then hit the tab key to autocomplete. I love autocomplete. Autocomplete is included, or I guess pre-installed, or pre um, added to your your bash profile when you start the exam, so you don't have to worry about learning how to do autocomplete or set your alias. So that's kind of nice. So the first troubleshooting step that we usually do is we describe the pod, right? So we have a pod here that's has these events at the bottom, and usually the events are you know the most verbose, not the most verbose, but contain a lot of useful information about why the container is in a failed state. So we have these events that's pulling the image, successfully pulled the image, created container MySQL, container image already present on machine. That's good. Backup restarting failed. And so backup restarting failed. Why do we so that's a clue as to, okay, never even started to begin with. So how do we start this container? And we can scroll up and look through other a lot of times there's a reason in here. Yeah, so there's a reason here that sometimes contains useful information. In this case, not. But there's a if you're describing a pod, you're getting all the information from it in terms of its current state. All right. So another thing that we usually do after we've looked at the describe for a pod, let's clear the screen. And another thing we can do is run get the logs from the container, right? Because the logs might contain more information about why the container has failed. The logs are the standard out and standard error from the container, and running kubectl logs. So k logs, and then you can just do, instead of doing pod, you can just do the name of the pod. So um, and if we run the logs, we can get some more information out of this container and why it's not starting. So in this case, the database is uninitialized and password option is not specified. So that's a really useful message. And so it actually tells us what we need to do to solve this. So this is the most helpful out of many of the logs that you may receive. So you need to specify one of the following as an environment variable. So MySQL root password, or MySQL allow empty password, or MySQL random root password. Okay, so this tells me that when I created the deployment, I didn't include an environment variable that sets the root password for MySQL. So let's clear the screen again, and we will go ahead and fix that, right? So we can do k-edit deploy MySQL, and this allows us to edit the deployment. Note that there's only certain things that I can change within this deployment, and um, one of the things happens to be to add this environment variable. But for example, if you wanted to change the name of the deployment, that would not be uh, acceptable in this case. So there's certain things that you can and cannot change within a deployment. Good thing to know for if you're trying to edit a deployment or change any characteristic about the running deployment. So anyways, I know that this environment variable is set within the container spec. So I scroll down here to where I have the spec and the container spec, not necessarily the spec for the deployment, which is up here, right? If we scroll down, it's indented 4 spaces. It's the spec for the container. So anyways, we go here in line with the image and we do environment. We have to, so environment. So we can set our environment variable, and we have to make sure that our spaces are correct here. So we'll do name MySQL root password, and then right under name, we'll do value and then password. And I can make up a more complicated password, but just for demonstration purposes. Anyways, I can save and quit, and that automatically changes my deployment. So you can do kubectl git deploy. Now I have 1 out of 1 ready. So kubectl git pod, and we could see now it's in a running state. So um, we have successfully troubleshooted the issue with the container within the pod. within the deployment. uh, 3 levels deep there, and then successfully edited the deployment and got this pod back up and running. And let's see, so we can do uh, TTL rollout history. Um, it didn't cause a rollout, so oh, it did. Okay, so if I do deploy and then MySQL, we can do the yeah. So because I made that change to deployment, it caused a rollout, and so there's actually a new version of this deployment, new replica set has been created, and I've actually rolled out to a new version. So a lot of times you can, if you make a change to a deployment, you can roll back to, we see revision 1 and revision 2. We're currently on revision 2, so we can go back to 1, or we can continue to roll out different versions of our application running in Kubernetes. So, anyways, let's stop sharing for a second and go back to the chat. All right, cool. All right, so first question is, how is K8s different to Docker Swarm? So Kubernetes is different than Docker Swarm in a few different ways. You know, I would say in general, Kubernetes is more complicated, and um, I think as a stepping stone to learning Kubernetes, I've heard and seen a lot of people learn Docker Swarm first because it's a lot easier to learn. There's less bells and whistles, and um, no, you have that reduced complexity there. So, um, in terms of the technical differences, I would say, Docker Swarm uses different commands to view your containers and how they're orchestrated versus Kubernetes. It's a different ecosystem entirely, so it's kind of comparing apples to oranges, but they are both container orchestrators and allow you to run multiple containers, replicated over a common control plane. So other do you have any questions? I guess Hem, who asked that question, do you have any specific questions as to the differences? I guess I could elaborate a little bit more. So Kubernetes has this concept of pods, deployments, as we just looked at. We have the this concept of persistent volumes, persistent volume claims, which are all unique to Kubernetes. So Docker Swarm has its own kind of set of uh, those same principles, but again, Kubernetes has that different terminology. So you have to kind of make that relation there when you're coming from Docker Swarm, or maybe learning the differences there. All right. So next question, and if you want to elaborate on that question, I'd be happy to. I don't honestly, I don't know much about Docker Swarm, so I can't speak to, a lot of the similarities between Docker Swarm and Kubernetes. But I can certainly, if you were to say what blank is in Docker Swarm, how is that similar to blank in Kubernetes? I could definitely answer that question and give you the Kubernetes perspective on that. All right, so next question is, I have a team internally who uses GitHub runners for CI/CD. They're looking to see if it's possible to have macOS-based container orchestrated by K8s to operate their runners based on Apple Silicon. So is it possible to have macOS-based containers orchestrated by Kubernetes to operate their runners? I think it is. I think it is possible. I mean, there in Kubernetes there is such thing as not only Linux containers but Windows containers, um, and I believe that there's. I don't know actually. I'm not sure if there's macOS based containers, but you certainly can bring your own containers to Kubernetes, and so as long as that um, as long as that container follows the, you know, best practices for building containers, which is a a principle that's developed by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Container Runtime Initiative. As long as those, best practices are implemented in running your container, I'm sure that it could be orchestrated by Kubernetes. So, that's that. So, you're looking to run macOS based containers for your GitHub runners, and so I'm sure that you could do that. I personally have never seen that before. Your next question was anybody tackled this before? If anybody, yeah, thanks Noel for jumping in there. It does look like it's possible to use Mac for hosted GitHub runners, and then he posted a link there. So yeah, very helpful. Thanks Noel. I have never come across that actually, so that's a new thing for me. But like I said, if it's a if it's a container, most likely it can run in Kubernetes. So yeah, and then Noel said I would personally go with learning Kubernetes unless there's a business need for learning Swarm. Yeah, a lot of times our decisions are kind of driven from our management at work, right? And or the customer who's making a preference uh, based on whether they want to use Kubernetes or Swarm. I think Citizens Bank has a really good presentation. I've seen at DockerCon. This is a few years back, so it may be on YouTube by now. But they kind of explained their path going from They went from Docker Swarm to Kubernetes and then back to Docker Swarm because of some of those complexities that I mentioned earlier. So I wonder if I could look that up real quick, or maybe somebody could help me out and look that up if it's on YouTube. So I would just search Citizens Bank DockerCon. Yeah, there it is. Swarm Kubernetes and back again. Okay, so I'll post this link in the chat here. So let's see. So yeah, I just posted that link in the chat so you can um, view that presentation from a previous DockerCon, and hopefully that'll just kind of shed some light on the differences between, or I guess the use cases in terms of business value of using Docker Swarm versus Kubernetes. And if you're just starting out and learning on your own, if this is not driven by your manager or a business decision, I mean, I might be sounding biased here, but I would definitely lean towards learning Kubernetes, just because you know Kubernetes is more heavily used, especially in industry. So if you want skills that will you know make you a more valuable candidate at your job, and allow you to move up in the rankings, and just give you more bang for your buck in terms of learning a new technology, I would say Kubernetes is going to be most valuable there. So I highly recommend Kubernetes for and Kubernetes is going to be around for a long time. So I would definitely I would make the investment in Kubernetes. Again, a biased opinion probably, but I would definitely, come join us in the KubeSkills community, and find out um, what it's like as a beginner, and I'm sure that you'll find that it's really it's a really good community. Has a lot of resources, and is a very um, widely used technology and platform. All right, so let's pick up back with the Q&A. So we kind of answered the question about the GitHub runners. Let me know, Paul, if you have any additional questions about that, um, and if Noel's response was adequate. And so let's go to the next question. So Michael, on EKS, when I deploy pods, they all go on one node until it fills up, and then goes to the next node. All nodes the same, all pods the same. How to get even distribution of pods across nodes? Okay, so um, okay. So this is where kind of node affinity comes into play here. So in Kubernetes, there's this concept of node affinity, where you can control, you can override the default settings for uh, having an affinity, your pod having affinity towards certain nodes, right? So if I set my affinity to make a preference to nodes that have a label of, disk equals SSD, for example, or maybe fast spinning disk versus slow spinning disk for performance reasons. That's a reason why I would use. That's a reason why I would use Affinity. So if you are noticing that all of your pods are going to one node until that node's resources are all filled up, I would look into using node affinity to node affinity and or pod affinity, and the difference there being that um, you can have a pod that preferences a certain node, but also you can have a pod that kind of prefers a node based on other pods running on that node. So to kind of have an example there, uh, so pod affinity is, let's say you want your MySQL pod to run on the same node as your, I don't know, Nginx pod. So using pod affinity, you can make a preference towards nodes that already have an Nginx replica pod running on them. You can also, make a preference to where if there's an Nginx pod running on it, I don't want my MySQL pod to run on that same node, right? So that in that case, you're um, you're getting to more of your question, which is how can I spread my pods more across all of my nodes more evenly? Whereas node affinity is just a plain and simple, if this node has label X, Y, or Z, go ahead and schedule that, say based on certain preferences. Um, go ahead and schedule that pod to that node that has that label, and that could be, this label could be applied to multiple nodes, or only one node, or what have you. So there's a lot of flexibility there in terms of um, the affinity that you can use to prefer a certain node. Doesn't mean that your pod doesn't get scheduled. It just means that um, your pod has a preference for this particular node. If that node's not available, then it can get scheduled to any one of the other nodes. So node affinity, pod affinity. Um, okay, next question is, um, scroll down a bit. Sorry. So recently completed my first live project using Amazon EKS. Congratulations. What is a recommended way to use ephemeral storage? Okay, so in Kubernetes, we have this concept of persistent volumes, which, or you're talking about ephemeral storage. So ephemeral storage or temporary storage, usually we use an empty dir type of volume, whether that's in a pod or in a deployment. Empty dir is the type of volume that you would use if you're looking um, to not have your storage persist. So it's the opposite of a persistent volume, and use ephemeral storage. So we try to set limit on per application, but sometimes it still gets evicted. Okay. Can you elaborate, Nick, a little bit about your situation? So you said you try to set a limit on it. So you try to set a limit on your pod, or um, so at limits you're talking about resource requests and limits, right? So resource requests and limits are um, certain values that I can apply to my pod to request a certain amount of CPU and RAM from a node, and then also limits are, you know, I I want to limit my pod to only using a certain amount of CPU and RAM. So you have a problem with your pods getting evicted. Is that right? So I'm not sure the problem as to why your pods are getting evicted if you're using ephemeral storage. Usually, ephemeral storage is using the storage, using the volume within the container. Okay, so yes, I set a resource limit on ephemeral storage to 100. All right, so I think you're mixing up the concepts a little bit here. You're talking about ephemeral storage, but then you're talking about setting the memory limit, right? Um, so I think you're talking about how do I get kind of a perfect balance between, setting my requests and limits, but not having my pod evicted from a node that doesn't meet those requirements, right? So storage is different than, CPU and memory. Um, and so I just want to make that differentiation there. All right, so let's come back to that. Um, yeah, cool. So next question: while on a project, while on a project, I had a hard time provisioning persistence for database. I'm currently writing an article about how I solved that. Helm chart was really helpful. Yeah. All right. So follow up question to that: your project, you said provisioning a database, and usually that's creating a stateful set, right? So in that um, in that provisioning, did you create a stateful set? And if so, what kind of I guess special um, implementations or special details that you have to include in that stateful set for to solve that problem, right? Because you're writing an article on how that was solved. I think that would really be helpful for everyone on the line here and everyone in the future. So let's okay. So I think this will really be a learning opportunity here for everyone. And if you have a link to your article, I would love to share that with the crew here as well. But but yeah, so provisioning persistence for the database. So again, persistent volumes. A lot of times with a stateful set, if that's the way that you created this database, which is very common. So in a stateful set, you have not only persistent volumes, but persistent volumes that are assigned to specific pods, and those pods being kind of unique from the other pods running in the cluster, right? So stateful sets are different than deployments in that they are applications that require state. What is state? State is all of the metadata and application data that's required for the application to run. And it's very common with databases because databases have this concept of kind of a master and slave relationship, whereas only one copy of the database can handle reads and writes. So that instance of that read write database has to be not only presented as the one that's being written to from other applications from your front end, for example, but also it needs to be able to replicate the data between the different the different copies or the different uh, instances of the database, right? All right, so Helm chart provisioned all that simply. Yeah, so Helm charts are very useful for deploying multiple uh, Kubernetes objects. So in a Helm chart, um, and I have a really good use case for that. So let me post that in the chat. So let's see. A database that I've used a lot in my job has been CockroachDB. And so CockroachDB is a database that's specifically designed for Kubernetes, and they have a nice tutorial on their site. And so I'll put that in the chat. And if anyone else is wanting to learn more about how to run databases in Kubernetes, I think that would be a good place to start, and and a really good opportunity to learn more about running stateful sets and also running databases in Kubernetes. So I think that would be a good learning opportunity. All right, so let's go to the next question. So I have limited Linux knowledge and skills. I can get by, but I get overwhelmed quickly when trying to learn Kubernetes. Do I need to up my Linux CLI knowledge to be successful with Kubernetes? So the answer to that is you don't have to be a Linux guru. So for Kubernetes, where Linux comes into play, obviously Kubernetes runs on Linux, but how that's useful in the context of learning Linux and the type of the level of knowledge you have to have about Linux is actually kind of at a beginner level, being that you just have to know about changing directories. You just have to know about the log location for all, which is common between all um, Linux machines, right? Var log. You have to know a little bit about services. And so for that, I would look into systemd and learning more about systemd and how it manages services running on Linux systems. I would also, for editing YAML on a Kubernetes cluster, a lot of times we use a text editor like Vim or Nano. So I would get familiar with using those types of text editors on Linux, and then and that's basically it. Being able to cat things out. So using using methods to look through and output information to the terminal. So using like cat, um, tail, more or less, all those types of kind of things that we use to get more output out of the terminal and out of certain files or services or whatever. Um, and then in terms of containers running on Kubernetes or containers running on Linux, I would get really familiar with how namespaces work, right? So I have a very good solution to that. Actually, it's a talk that I did over on the Cube Simplify channel, um, which got which has gotten pretty good popularity and has helped a lot of people. Um, yeah, post that in the chat, and you can view that video, which is 6 hours long, but it's just a Linux and Docker fundamentals course that you can take for free on YouTube. So I think that would be helpful as a starter, and that kind of goes through some of the basics there. So Yeah, being able to traverse the Linux file system, being able to know common places to find logs and also binaries, right? So the user bin or user local bin are common directories for storing your binaries for applications or services, and then knowing how to list contents, knowing how to pipe, and how to get information back out of the terminal, learning about standard error, standard out, um, and what else did I say? So I went through just the container basics, so learning about C groups and namespaces, and learning about how um, how this abstraction occurs, when we run containers and we run them in this kind of separated environment from our Linux systems, but still they share the same Linux kernel, right? So that's something that I cover in that video that I will show on the screen here. So take a look at that video. Again, 6 hours long. You may want to break it up, but really helpful for learning all the Linux and Docker basics that you have to learn in order to kind of jumpstart you for learning Kubernetes. And in terms of learning Kubernetes, in terms of order of operations, right? So I wouldn't let that deter you from using Kubernetes and using the kubectl command line. Um, it's just obviously would help you in terms of you know um, running Kubernetes and maybe troubleshooting Kubernetes, being able to look at it from kind of under the hood perspective. And but yeah, I wouldn't let it deter you from learning Kubernetes, but just know that these things that about Linux and Docker, these are helpful, and learning about containers in general are very helpful to learning Kubernetes. Yeah, so I think I've beaten that dead horse about that. So let's see. Let's continue with the questions. Do you guys have a demo of administrating Kates with Visual Studio Code and any cheat sheet methods to make life easier? Um, Visual Studio Code. I mean, I think there are. So in terms of building applications and then pushing them to a container registry, or just using Kubernetes in general with Visual Studio Code. Um, for that, I would definitely recommend going over to killercoded.com, which has in the browser not only a terminal but also um, a way for you to use Visual Studio Code in the browser. So killercoded.com is where I would start with that. So let me just show you real quick what that looks like, and maybe that'll be helpful for you. So if I go over here to my Kubernetes playground on killercoded.com, I can see not only do I have this terminal, which I can do, kubectl commands, but I can also go click on this editor tab here, and then that brings it up in a Visual Studio Code like interface. And so I can work from the terminal here, or I can work with my YAML files in the editor. Let's say I wanted to um, actually, let's do a quick way. So kubectl run nginx image nginx. Oops, I meant to do a dry run. So dry run equals client YAML, and then output that to pod.yaml. So yeah, we could look at our pod YAML up above in the text editor in Visual Studio Code, and then down below we can continue to run our commands. So that's really cool for like the quickest way to get up and running with a Visual Studio Code like environment. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. All right. Um, Where did it all start for you? All right, so I have pretty unique situation in which back in 2017, I was working at a small startup here in Austin, Texas, and I was kind of thrown into this Kubernetes thing. I had never heard of Kubernetes before that. I came from an operations background, so I was the person that was racking and stacking and setting up VMware and doing a lot of virtualization, but never really got into Kubernetes or even containers. But the startup that I was working at, hey Andre, how you doing? The startup that I was working at decided that they wanted to use kind of the latest and greatest in terms of Kubernetes containers and using Jenkins for their CI/CD pipeline and all of uh, the DevOps methodologies and ways that we all know is common today, right? But back in 2017, um, it wasn't as common, believe it or not, even though Kubernetes had been out for a couple years. But anyways, I got thrown into it, and it was a really interesting experience because it allowed me to learn on the fly and um, learn trial by fire in a lot of ways, which was not fun in a lot of cases, but also like it makes for a good story, right? So it was interesting to say the least. And then yeah, I think that kind of fueled my energy and my drive to teach everyone else about Kubernetes because I didn't want them to go through that same experience because it was kind of painful. So yeah, that's my backstory. I can tell you more about it if you'd like on another time. But yeah, I got thrown into it, trial by fire, had to learn it from scratch, had to go um, really deep into running Kubernetes. It was actually on AKS at the time, which was very uh, it's not what it is today. AKS back in 2017 was in its infancy, and Azure in general was really um, primitive. So it was really harder to use, much harder than it was today. But anyways, so let's continue. We got a couple minutes here, so let's continue with the questions. So, what's the best way to track the health of my Kubernetes applications? I appreciate you may have this in your curriculum. Yeah. So, tracking health in terms of you know logging and monitoring. My tool of choice and a very popular choice is Prometheus. And if you need to visualize that in any way, if you need to um, you know, a lot of times I use it for exporting charts so that my manager or the CIO can look at that in a more visually appealing way. You can use Grafana. So so yeah, Prometheus and Grafana are my choice for tracking the health of a Kubernetes application. I know that Noel uses his at his job. He uses Datadog. So Datadog is an APM or application performance monitoring. It's more of a more complex and more comprehensive suite of tools, and also costs a lot more than the open source version of Prometheus, but is also a good option. And then uh, Noel, you and I have talked before about Noel, if you're still there. We've talked about kind of the differences between New Relic, which I've used in my past jobs, and then Datadog. So there's New Relic and Datadog are the top kind of enterprise APM platforms, and then um, if you're just getting started. So I actually have a video on setting up Prometheus. So let me put that in the chat. That would be helpful for you, I think. And it has to do with installing Prometheus as an operator, which is also useful because operators are kind of a quick way to run our controllers in Kubernetes. So let's find that video and I'll post it in the chat. All right, so I know we're running over on time. Apologies for that, but let's so this is the link for getting Prometheus and Grafana up and running in your cluster. And in this video, I actually walk through how to do it in Killer Coda, so you don't even have to touch your local cluster or your personal cluster. Okay, so next question. I'll just do two more questions and then I'll end because we only kind of allocated an hour for this Q&A session. I do appreciate the questions though. Keep them coming in, and I'll ask them offline. And again, you can always go to the KubeSkills community, kubeskills.com, to post those questions in the community as well. All right. So, how do you monitor the uptime of complex clusters? So, this is a good question. Um, so complex clusters, you know, I'm taking that to mean like you're using something like Istio for service mesh or Linkerd or something along those lines. I think what I would say about that is try to implement your monitoring solution to harness everything that is about whatever running application that you're kind of focused in on. So, for example, like if I have a production application that requires an SLA of 98% uptime or something like that, I would want to try to set up my monitoring so that it focuses on the pieces of that application, like the deployment, like the service, like the ingress of just that of just those pieces that are most important to you. So more complex clusters. Usually, if you do have a more complex cluster, you're usually using like a tool like Datadog or New Relic, um, which is, like I said, a more comprehensive platform. But besides that, in terms of using Prometheus for monitoring, I would try to separate your monitoring, your instances of Prometheus, or the way that you set up Prometheus to kind of hone in on, and you can do that within Prometheus as well as try to, um, you can use the PromQL to query based on certain characteristics of that application. So that's definitely a capability there as well. What can I say about Rancher? So Rancher, um, I use Rancher all the time at work. I know that Noel, he's used Rancher, or is I think you're migrating off of Rancher, right? So that's Rancher is a very popular distribution of Kubernetes. If you don't know, there's not only Kubernetes, uh, bare bones Kubernetes, but there's also these distributions, right? A lot like there's Linux distributions, there's Kubernetes distributions. So one is Rancher. Rancher also has a K9 or K3s. There's OpenShift. Um, there's all the managed clusters and cloud, and the list goes on and on. There's tons of them. So Rancher, I think, the way that we use Rancher today is in secured environments where you have to get a cluster up and running locally, and Rancher provides a good way to not only run that locally, but also provide a dashboard for anyone that's trying to view what's going on in the cluster. So Rancher provides an easy to use and uh, I think preferable to the Kubernetes dashboard in a lot of ways, to viewing what's going on in your cluster. So that's what I'll say about Rancher. Okay, so that concludes our questions. Sorry if I didn't get to your question before the end here, um, but I do appreciate you joining today. Thanks everyone for asking questions and making this a really valuable and um, useful time here. So with that, I will just conclude with again, joining the KubeSkills community. I highly encourage you to join the KubeSkills community, I'll just do a short little plug here for community.kubeskills.com. And if you go to kubeskills.com, you can get there too. But community.kubeskills.com is where is the kind of direct entry into our community, and where you can go through those channels that I went through before, and start posting your questions, start saying hello, and I'm sure that you'll be welcomed with open arms. So that will conclude this session. Thanks again for joining, everyone, and have a great day. Bye.